Hi everyone, this is an overview of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1. And in this presentation, I'm just going to cover the highlights and give you some explanations. So the purpose of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is to, or at least Book 1, is to identify what is the human good. So if he can identify the human good, then he can tell us what the right thing to do is, and he can build a complete ethics on this foundation. So let's go ahead and jump in and see how I get started. We're going to skip part 1, go right to part 2. These are short sections. He says, if then there is some end of the things we do, which we desire for its own sake, everything else being desired for the sake of this, and if we do not choose everything for the sake of something else, for at that rate the process would go on to infinity, so that our desire would be empty and vain, clearly this must be the good, and the chief good, or the highest good. Will not the knowledge of it then have great influence on life? And so again, he's trying to identify that human good, the highest human good for which we do everything else, for the sake of which we do everything else. And he thinks that if we identify this good, he says it will have great influence on our life. It will be a great practical benefit for us living our lives and knowing what the right thing to do is. Part 3, he says, now fine and just actions which political science investigates admit of much variety and fluctuation of opinion. So he says he's doing political science. What you might have in mind is political science or political philosophy. He's doing partly ethics and he's doing partly political philosophy here. There's also some parallels between this work and the work of his teacher Plato in his Republic. So he's saying in this section that in his methodology we have to expect only as much precision as the science will allow. He says, quote, we must be content then in speaking of such subjects and with such premises to indicate the truth roughly and in outline, and in speaking about things which are only for the most part true. He continues, for it is the mark of an educated man to look for precision in each class of things just so far as the nature of the subject admits. So he admits that this isn't going to be as precise as some other sciences, but he should be able to produce some results here. He's not a relativist. He doesn't think that just because we've got so many opinions, a diversity of opinions, that there is no truth to the matter. No, he thinks there is a truth to the matter. And he's going to attempt to tell us what that is. Moving on to part 4, he says, verbally there is very general agreement for both the general run of men and people of superior refinement say that it is happiness, and identify living well and doing well with being happy. But with regard to what happiness is, they differ, and the many do not give the same account as the wise. So what is that highest good for human beings? He says it looks like most people think it's happiness. And the word here for happiness is eudaimonia. So we're not talking about happiness in terms of what we mean by happiness in English, just like a state of mind. I feel happy, I feel pleasure, I feel satisfied, although that's a part of it. For him, he's thinking of something deeper. This would be something more complete than just a state of mind, but a full life. Some words that are sometimes used here include things like fullness or thriving. So when we're talking about happiness, we're talking about something much more than just a state of mind. Part 5, he says, for there are, we may say, 3 prominent types of life. That just mentioned, the political, and thirdly, the contemplative life. Now the mass of mankind are evidently quite slavish in their tastes, preferring a life suitable to beasts. So what is it that makes us happy? Human beings, people in society say that there are these 3 options. Here we have 4 actually, but 3 options. The life of pleasure, and he thinks that that's not a good candidate for the highest human life because he compares it to, as he says, a life suitable to beasts or animals. So there's got to be something different than just living a life of pleasure that distinguishes us from the animals. Second, he considers, he says, people of superior refinement and of active disposition identify happiness with honor. for this is, roughly speaking, the end of the political life. So he considers that as a possibility, the honorable life, bravery, courage, and the like. But he says there's something more, there's got to be something more to life than just honor, and that depends so much on life circumstances. Third, he comes to the contemplative life, which we shall consider later. That means this is what he's going to consider in more detail in the rest of the work. And finally, he considers the life of money-making. He says the life of money-making is one undertaken under compulsion, and wealth is evidently not good, the good we are seeking, for it is merely useful and for the sake of something else. So the life of earning money is just an instrumental good for something else. He doesn't think it's something that we love for its own sake, so he rejects that. And he leaves open the possibility that the contemplative life is what we're after. Now, moving on to part 6, he considers the teachings of his teacher, Plato, and he's going to reject at least one idea that comes from Plato. He says that the forms have been introduced by friends of our own, and he says piety requires us to honor truth above our friends. So what he's going to do is reject Plato's idea of the forms. That is, if you're not familiar with it yet, this abstract realm of ideas that correspond to the physical world. So he's going to reject that. He's going to say that there's not going to be one common idea of the good that can be found in all things. Instead, there's a diversity of goods here. But we don't need to go too far into this section. We'll just go ahead and move on to part 7. He says, let us again return to the good we are seeking and ask what it can be. It seems different in different actions and arts. It is different in medicine, in strategy, and in other arts likewise. What then is the good of each? He continues, quote, since there are evidently more than one end, or good, and we choose some of these, for example, wealth, flutes, and in general instruments, for the sake of something else, clearly not all ends are final ends, but the chief good is evidently something final. Therefore, if there is only one final end, this will be what we are seeking, and if there are more than one, the most final of these will be what we are seeking. So maybe he's assuming here that there is in fact one final end. Maybe there are multiple goods or ends that are the highest ones. I don't know, that's a matter for another discussion. But he's really after this idea of a final good, this final end, which he calls happiness or eudaimonia. He says, now such a thing as happiness above all else is held to be, for this we choose always for self and never for the sake of something else. So he thinks all the other goods in life can be are instrumental or chosen for the sake of this life of happiness, and he lists those below. Okay, moving on, we get to the function argument here. So this is where he describes what it is to be a good human being. He says, for just as for a flute player, a sculptor, or an artist, and in general for all things that have a function or activity, the good and the well is thought to reside in the function. So would it seem to be for man, if he has a function. Have the carpenter then and the tanner certain functions or activities, and has man none? Is he born without a function? Or has eye, hand, foot, and in general each of the parts evidently has a function? May one lay it down that man similarly has a function apart from all these? What then can this be? So this is the function argument. He's now trying to consider, if we're to determine what it means for a human being to be happy, we need to ask what it means for a human being to function well. That will be the answer then. He considers several options below, and just to make matters short, he says at the bottom of this paragraph, human good turns out to be activity of soul in accordance with virtue, and if there are more than one virtue, in accordance with the best and the most complete. So he thinks that there's some sort of activity that's unique to human beings above any other sort of creature or animal in nature that sets us apart, and it's cultivating that aspect of our being that will make us happy. So he identifies that as the activity of soul. Moving on to the next section, part 8, we must consider it, however, in the light not only of our conclusion and of our premises, but also of what is commonly said about it. For with a true view, all the data harmonize, but with a false one, the facts soon clash. So in this section, he's saying that he wants his philosophy to harmonize with popular opinion. He wants to take in common sense and common opinions, views on the matter, and he thinks that whatever his philosophy is going to be, it should square with those things. He then adds that virtue has to be some sort of action because people identify the good with action. So whatever we're talking about here, the virtue has to be tied to activity. It's not enough just to be a certain type of person. You've also got to do, so that one's actions have to come out of one's character. He also thinks that the moral life is going to be a pleasant one. He says their life is also itself pleasant. He rejected earlier the search for pleasure as the ultimate end or the ultimate good, but he doesn't want to reject the idea that the moral life is itself enjoyable. So as a result of being good, you're going to be happy in the sense of having pleasure, but it's not the main goal. Moving on to part 9. So he here considers whether or not the eudaimonia or happiness comes from chance. He says, for this reason, also the question is asked whether happiness is to be acquired by learning or by habituation or some other sort of training, or comes in virtue of some divine providence, or again by chance. And so he's going to say that it's not a matter of chance. He says that the answer to this question we are asking is plain also from the definition of happiness, for it has been said to be a virtuous activity of the soul. So it comes from within us, not from outside. It's not external to us. And he says, it is natural then that we call neither ox nor horse nor any other of the animals happy, for none of them is capable of sharing in such activity, that is the activity of a soul. For this reason also a boy is not happy. This is maybe controversial here, but he says a boy or a child is not happy, for he is not yet capable of such acts, owing to his age. And boys who are called happy are being congratulated by reason of the hopes we have for them, for there is required, as we said, not only complete virtue, but also a complete life. So it's not a matter of having one's circumstances work out well. I mean, the circumstances of an animal might work out well, but we wouldn't want to say that that creature is happy in the same way that a human being is happy. So there's got to be something more about it, and it has to do with the activity of the soul. So part 10 then, moving on, he considers the question of whether or not we can judge a person's life as being good or happy while that person is still alive, or do we have to wait till the very end to decide this? He asks, must no one at all then be called happy while he lives? Must we, as Solon says, see the end? The idea here is because, a person may live a really good life and have great circumstances in their life, the first half of their life, or even the majority of their life, but at the end they could meet some really tragic circumstances, and we would be tempted to say in such circumstances that that person didn't live a good life because it ended so poorly because of something outside of their control. But he's going to say that that's not the case. We can still make a judgment because whether or not someone is living a good life is a question of where that source is coming from, and he's going to say it's coming from within. So he says the attribute in question then will belong to a happy man, and he will be happy throughout his life, for always, or by preference to everything else, he will be engaged in virtuous action and contemplation, and he will bear the chances of life most nobly and altogether decorously. So no matter what happens to this person is going to be happy in the full sense because they live a virtuous life of the soul. So he continues. He says, if activities are, as we said, what gives life its character, no happy man can become miserable, for he will never do the acts that are hateful and mean. For the man who is truly good and wise, we think, bears all the chances life becomingly and always makes the best of the circumstances. He continues, If this is the case, the happy man can never become miserable, though he will not reach blessedness if he meets with fortunes like those of Priam. Priam is the father of Hector in the Iliad, whose life didn't end very well, even though he was a good man. So again, he's just saying it doesn't matter. Life circumstances don't matter. What matters is the soul, the virtuous soul. All right, we're going to skip down here, part 11, part 12, and now ending up with the last section of the book, part 13. He says, since happiness is an activity of soul in accordance with perfect virtue, we must consider the nature of the virtue. And so we're going to explore here how does virtue relate to the soul. And he identifies two elements in the soul. He actually identifies more, but in this section he focuses on these two, the irrational and the rational. And so he then explores the irrational element, saying that the irrational element, one division seems to be widely distributed and vegetative in its nature. I mean that which causes nutrition and growth. So you've got this part of the irrational side of us that's involved with biological growth. And that's not the part that he's concerned with here. That's going to happen no matter what. But there's this other part of the irrational element in the soul, he says, one which in a sense, however, shares in a rational principle. He says, for we praise the rational principle of the continent man and of the incontinent. Okay, so now I have to introduce this idea, this distinction between a continent man and an incontinent man. So the continent man is one who knows what the right thing to do is and does it. And the incontinent person is the one who knows what the right thing to do is and doesn't do it, okay, fails to do it. And so he's saying here that there is this element in both of these people. So he says we praise the rational principle in both of these people, the continent and the incontinent, because that rational principle in both of them recognizes what the right thing to do is. But at the same time, in the incontinent person, there's something that fails. He says, quote, for exactly as paralyzed limbs, when we intend to move them to the right, turn on the contrary to the left, so is it with the soul. The impulses of the incontinent people move in contrary directions. So we've got this aspect of the soul, that this irrational part of the incontinent person that doesn't follow the rational part, and there's a problem there. But we praise the continent person because their irrational part follows the rational part. So we praise that person and we honor them. So at the very end, he wraps up this section saying that virtue is distinguished in two types. We've got the intellectual virtues, the virtues of knowledge or knowing, and we've got the moral virtues, the virtues of courage. And we praise the virtues of the mind and the virtues of character, and we're going to explore both of those. Well, he's going to explore throughout this book both of those in more detail. All right, I hope you found that helpful.